that up there because I was way off base as far as.
Well, so at first we were gonna just do the first part, but I hadn't finished it forward.
Well, no, because I thought it was only through 7, and then when you said 12, I said, oh my
Is
God.
this letting me talk? Can you hear me? It's not on? We'll try it for you.
And the only other criticism that I'm not even gonna tell Ann is that the video on the teacher's just great. But
Is that what you talk about?
And what
There we go.
all those teachers.
Hello.
That's
You switched up on us.
So,
Oh, we moved down here, yeah, a while ago.
Oh, that's right, but I was still in the other room, but.
Have a seat.
Oh, she didn't
Just
respond
don't
to me yet. But I'll see if she does.
Hey Judy, oh, I like that. That's my favorite.
How is everyone doing? So before we begin to kind of work our way down, I have three housekeeping things. The first one, I have more numbers charts if anyone is missing them for the outline. I will get more of these made. I didn't make enough apparently, okay.
Do you need one, Joe?
I do, but do you need one?
I'll get one from you later.
Okay.
I'll get it.
Yeah,
Remind
later.
Why don't you look on that?
So these are the ones that come from the Bible Project, and I now figured out why the printer wasn't working. It's because I had paper that was ½ an inch too large. And it looked exactly the same. Yeah, well I sat there and I was like, why is this not working? And apparently there is also 18 by 12 paper
Oh.
that is just like the little tray is a ½ inch more out, and so it didn't work with our printer. The next housekeeping thing is our schedule through May. I'm going to assume one of these weeks something will end up happening that we might delay, and so then this might get pushed back. But I have finished going through numbers for our outline, so this should be our schedule for finishing it. So we'll finish it there in the beginning of May at some point. And I will send this schedule out. In the parentheses, I put the easier way of looking at it, but when we talk about it in class, we will break up some of the chapters just by those little verses there in chapter 25. The next housekeeping, Marcia had a question. And I was going to see if anyone else had.
No, it's not about this.
Oh, it's not about this?
It's about Sunday.
Oh, okay. Well, does anyone else have questions about what we read today, for today? It is, I'll say this about this passage. This section of Numbers includes my favorite part in all of Numbers at the end of our reading. It also includes some of the hardest scenes in the Bible that cause lots of uncomfortable questions that will come on pretty quick.
Well, I learned a new word, Cushite.
Yes. Also, Ethiopian is how some translations will do Cushite.
So it just said Egyptians referred to black people as Cushites.
That actually is my favorite part in Numbers, is that scene. When Moses marries a Cushite, or a lot of older translations will say an Ethiopian. It's right south of Africa, of Egypt, in the north of Africa.
One of the poorest countries in the world. And, of course, the famous benediction from Numbers.
Yes.
The war.
Well, we were talking about that.
I mean, that's been part of our service since I was old enough to hear English. I mean, it just, a standard benediction that has been in the Episcopal liturgy at least. I think the Catholic liturgy too.
Lutheran.
It's one of those hidden
It just
gems.
pops up.
For me, when I'm reading through Numbers and I'm like, oh, I recognize that passage, and I never would have thought it was over here.
Because you're reading through all this minutiae
Yeah.
about how they disassembled the altar and loaded it onto the carrying poles and all this paragraph after paragraph. And then somebody the benediction.
There's these snippets that sneak in there. I learned a new word this week too in Hebrew. We'll come to it later. I'll wait for it.
They must have felt that was important to include all that minutiae, because whoever was writing that, or whoever was editing it, or the ancient Jews that preserved it, I mean, where else in the Bible do you have that excruciating detail about it?
Yeah. Well, I kind of feel like, so there at the end of chapter 6, the Lord bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you, that it's like, man, that was some really boring things. What was that blessing that we did at the temple? Let's put that right here. kind of break it up a little bit. Is there any other, for these chapters that we read, questions that popped up for you, or thoughts that popped up for you?
This may not even be related, but I had the thought. So, giving each group very specific assignments and stay within that assignment, it reminded me of spiritual gifts and operating within your spiritual gifts.
Yeah.
And I mean, we don't have the law about that, but I think that they were given very specific things, but they wasn't just random. You picked that particular group of people with that particular. So anyway, that was my thought.
So there is, like, for the Levites, so the specific clans all have these specific duties. To me, the most special part is the Nazirite vow that pops up, because it's like, well, what about everyone else? What if they wanted to do this sacred work too? And there was a way for them to.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of parts in this section of Numbers, like this is going to be the second Passover. In the first Passover, it was only the circumcised. And now there's provisions made for uncircumcised non-Jews or non-Israelites living in the land, or for people that are out traveling, there's a way for them to participate. And so there's like specific roles, but there's also an expansion, which makes this section of Numbers really
And is it what we're supposed to do with our spiritual gifts? So to bring people from outside in?
We would hope. And I think that's what's cool about this is we're beginning to see the people of Israel grow. And this moment with the Cushites it's almost like there's racial overtones. We are the people of God, and it's not limited to who can come. And so there's this large expansion that for me makes this section really some of my favorite for all of Numbers. All right, who's ready to begin walking through it? So here is our coming up. So next week, we will look at chapters 13 through chapter 18. And then we'll keep on working our way through. Here we are in our map. So as a reminder for this map, the yellow stars are where we have already been. And the red stars are where we are going to go, at least some of the highlights, the big cities and the big scenes. We are still in Mount Sinai. By the end of today, we're packing up, and we're going to begin the journey leaving Mount Sinai. And next week, we're going to arrive in the wilderness of Paran. That's there in the middle, that next section. That's where we are on our map. We will keep coming back to that. As a reminder for Numbers, kind of the tagline for what this book is, it is rebellion in the wilderness. And so we are going to see that begin to unfold now in chapter 10. I'm going to scoot this camera over. In chapter 10, it's going to set off this next section. I think it goes to chapter 22. I'll have to look at our slide when we get there. But this is known as the murmurings, and it begins this section of more of this rebellion is going to begin to come out. When we get to that, we'll talk about this in more detail, but the complaints and the murmurings that happen, they're not just complaints about their situation, it's actually a rejection of God. It's a rejection of Yahweh. And so when we come to that in chapter 10 and in chapter 11, there's a very serious response. And that's because here we are, this rebellion, this complaint is a rejection of God and of this way of life with God. Here's our outline. I'll get more printed, so for those that need them, catch me afterward and we'll see if the printer likes us today. And this is where our main outline is coming from. So you can break numbers up into 3 different sections based on the place. So we are in the first section in the wilderness around Mount Sinai. Next week, we're going to be entering the wilderness of Paran, and then at the end of the book, they're going to come to Moab, and that's kind of the outskirts of the promised land when we get there. And this is what we looked at last week. So the first 4 chapters, or at least the first 3.5. Chapter 1 was that big census of all of the warriors, so all of the men of fighting age. Chapter 2 talks about the arrangement of the camp, and it put the tabernacle at the center, and then the different clans of the Levites are around the tabernacle. And then on the outside, there's groups of 3 of all the 12 tribes that surround them. And there's a very ordered way for how the tribe moves, or the tribes move, and we're going to see that today. It's very specific on which group leaves first and which one leaves all of the sections. Very detailed. Chapter 3, now there is a census in the duties of the Levites. So as a reminder, they're the ones that serve around the tabernacle, later the temple, and they don't fight in the wars or the battles, so they're a separate census. And then we talked about their duties. This was a makeup of all of the tribes. If you add up all the men, it's about 600,000. If you add that to the women with the numbers, it makes around 2 million. And last time that we met, we talked about some different theories because that number is a very big number. And so there's different theories about that number. And if you're curious about that, you can ask me and we can go over it afterwards. And this is a makeup, though, of all of the tribes. I like this picture. It kind of just shows you the numbers of all of them. And the Levites were pretty big, too. They're the ones up on the top. That's a rough makeup of what we went over last week. Here's a picture there of all the tribes, or the tabernacle in the middle. Here's a more detailed look of how that was. The red stars are the leaders of each group. And then, yeah, that was what we looked at. And we talked about the sons of Aaron, all the different Levites. And this is where we're going to come today. So this is chapters 4 through 12. We look at the duties of the Levites. In chapter 5, it's going to cover the laws of purity. Chapter 6 is the Nazirite vow, and I'll tell that one is special to me, so I'm excited for us to look at it. Chapter 7 is all these offerings of the tribal leaders. One of the things you'll notice, a lot of these first 5 books of the Bible are very repetitive, and so here's another offering for the tabernacle. And so yet again, we're emphasizing how the worship of God is so important, how it's so sacred. Chapter 8 is another look at the Levites. Chapter 9 is where things begin to change. This is going to happen the second Passover, and it's going to talk about the cloud or the pillar of fire that's going to be there to guide the camp. Chapter 10 is going to begin the departure from Sinai. It also is going to set off in chapter 11 the next series of complaints or the murmurs. And then in chapter 12, this is the part where Moses marries the Cushite. I'm excited for us to end right there because it's my favorite scene in all of Numbers. It's funny. But let's talk here about chapter 4. So roughly we can say there's 3 clans of the Levites. There's the Kohathites, the Gershonites, and the Merarites. We talked about the Kohathites last time. These are the ones that are dealing with the most sacred objects in the tabernacle. And they are actually the ones that go inside. And so they have a very special duty amongst the Levites. And it's also the most dangerous of the duties for the Levites. So when they go inside the tabernacle, if they are unclean or impure, they can die. And so this is a glorified role, but it comes with a lot more responsibility for all of it. The Gershonites, they were the ones charged with carrying the curtains for the tabernacle. And then there's the Merarites, and they're the ones that are bringing all of that metal and the wood frames and everything. I thought about us talking in a little bit more detail. I'll just say this, and I'll keep this here in our slides in case someone wants to look at it. So for the Kohathites, they are being overseen by Eleazar, who is one of Aaron's sons. And so these are all Levites, but Aaron's sons are the highest priestly class. And they are charged with the oversight over these lower Levites, if you will. And so these Levites, the Kohathites, the Gershonites, the Merarites, they're not the ones making the sacrifices and everything like that. They have other duties. And so it's the other Aaron's sons that do that, and they oversee these clans. The Gershonites are the ones that are moving the actual coverings and all of the curtains. This also came with a lot of other specialized tasks, because there was a lot of the different coverings. If you remember, when we talked about it, some are made with goat's hair, some are made with other fine materials. They're responsible for making sure it all stays in good condition. And so that means repairing it, that means sourcing more materials for replacing it. So there's a lot of duties that go to this. And they are different than the Kohathites because they're not going inside the tabernacle. And later they don't go inside the temple. And they have another one of Aaron's sons that's going to oversee them, so not Eleazar. And then lastly, there is the Merarites. So they're the ones that are moving all of the heavy objects, the pillars, the frame, the metal and the wood and everything, and making sure, again, it's in good order. And they are also overseen by one of Aaron's sons. That's chapter 4. It's really fascinating stuff. Any questions about those three groups? Okay, here's the pop quiz, because we just covered it. Which of them are carrying the Ark of the Covenant right there?
Am I right? Well,
It's the Kohathites. Since the Ark of the Covenant is one of the sacred objects inside the tabernacle, they are the ones that can move it. And if you remember later, I think it's in 1 Samuel with David, the ark begins to fall and one of them reaches out to catch it and is struck dead. And so this is one of those scary tasks to be in. So there's a future reference to one of the Kohathites. All right, any other questions on that?
Did they have, in something we've read today about oxen and carts, are those used to transport the frames?
That's a good question. I feel like I remember a story about the Philistines take the Ark of the Covenant and it goes on a cart and finds its way back into Jerusalem or something. But I think it was mainly carried by people, but I don't know. Marilyn?
I'm sorry?
Sometimes you know random Bible facts. Was the Ark of the Covenant ever carried by oxen and carts?
Now, I was thinking
Do not
about
know that.
the frames and support structure.
Oh, for that. I would imagine they probably had some help for some of those heavier parts. If not, they'd probably be really strong, I guess. I do not know that. I am kind of curious though. And I don't know if it covers some of those parts.
Somewhere I read about some of the tribes
Yeah.
contributing oxen and carts. Is that right? Did we read that from today?
We're gonna come to a part in a couple of chapters that's gonna be there.
Okay.
I think it's chapter. I don't know, I can't see that far on my PowerPoint. But this is chapter 4, so we're dealing with the sacredness of the tabernacle. But now one of those questions comes up. How do we go to the tabernacle, and how do we stay ritually pure? How do we stay ritually clean so that they can participate in the tabernacle? And I want to have a reminder, the tabernacle, it's not about containing God away from the people. The tabernacle is about God getting closer to the people. And so if God lives up here in the heavens and we've never been able to get to God, the tabernacle is like a little place of heaven for God to come down into, and people get to meet with God. what's really cool about the story of the Old Testament is those places get bigger and bigger and bigger until with Jesus, when the temple curtain is torn, now God's everywhere. And so this is God getting closer and closer to people. And so all of these rituals and everything, it's not about keeping us away from God. It's about getting as close to God as we can. And that gives us into chapter 5 that has to do with these laws of purity. And so there's a couple of different sections that this chapter deals with. One has to do with uncleanliness. So if you are having open sores, if you're openly bleeding, that blood would make you ritually impure. And so some people with skin diseases would mean that they could never come to the tabernacle because they would always be pure. That would also be true if you had touched a dead body or something like that. You would be ritually impure. And so there are provisions made for those people to come and still be able to worship with God. There's also restitutions in the middle of the chapter for those that have done wrong, and so that they don't remain impure. And so what's kind of cool about this is you're seeing someone not at fault. They just have a skin disease. And you're also seeing people at fault. And there's provisions made for everyone to come back and to be there for the tabernacle. This chapter ends with the ordeal of the suspected adulteress. We will come to that in a moment, and we're going to talk about this. But let's talk about these first two things. So for those that are unclean, so if you have skin diseases, bodily discharge, or you've made contact with a corpse, they are ritually unclean. And so there are provisions made for all of them before they can come back. You can think about this being there for two reasons. One is just simple hygiene and health for the community. If you have skin diseases, those are very easily spreadable. And so you don't want people in close contact with others. Same thing with dead bodies and other things. It's about keeping the community safe. But these things also represent spiritual purity. And so they're used as pictures. They're used as examples in teaching moments and such. I will say this about bodily discharges. So this would include if someone had given birth or a woman on her period. I was at this church, I think it was a Pentecostal church down in Florida. And this was the passage that the sermon was on. Of all things. I know, yeah, there's a lot of weird faces. And it became something really special. So there was a woman that was preaching, and she talked about how she grew up. And this passage here would make her feel so sad because every month she would be unclean. But then she said, I came to really appreciate this, and I got our family to adopt this practice because they would get a whole week off. That would mean no chores, your kids can't bother you, you don't have to cook. She just gets to lay in bed. And so, there we go, I wanted to share that with you. I thought it was a little humorous. There is also here restitutions for wrongdoing. And so if someone has wronged someone else, there are stipulations for how they have confession. If they've stolen something or broken something, they pay back the full value, and there's a penalty that they pay to the person. And then there's other things that are given with them going to the priest, and what can they do if they can't pay back. And so all of these rules they're ordering the community. And I think I have this on, oh, don't read that one yet. Okay, and so all of these things in chapter 5, they're dealing with community health. They're making sure everyone stays safe. They're dealing with the holiness. So these things are representing spiritual realities for them. But it also has to do with social justice. And then there's this part about marital fidelity. And so that gets us into this ordeal of the suspected adulteress. Who has read this passage before? Before today. Or before this week or something. Becky, are you the only one? Have you read it in the past?
No, but I've read it before today.
Before today, okay. I read it yesterday. So this was a passage that, so if you haven't read it, so when a wife was suspected of infidelity, they would go through a ritual and make bitter water. And the woman, so this was if not if she was caught in adultery, if she was suspected of adultery. And the husband suspects her, but there is no proof. So they weren't caught in the act or something like that. they would go through this ritual of making bitter water, and they would go before the priest, and she would drink it. And then the outcome of that, the way that it's translated, varies. So in the NRSV, it says, let me find it right here. So this is in verse 27. When he has made her drink the water, then if she has defiled herself and has been unfaithful to her husband, the water that brings the curse shall enter into her and cause bitter pain, and her womb shall discharge, her uterus drop, and the woman shall become an extortion among her people. But if she has not defiled herself and is clean, then she shall be immune and be able to conceive children. In the NRSV, it translates the uterus dropping as miscarried. And so, yeah, so there is a different translation. And the word in Hebrew, so there's a word for drop and there's a word for thigh. It is not the word for womb. And so it becomes unclear how to translate this. And so most scholars kind of fall into two camps for what is happening here. So there is some kind of poison that she is drinking, and they are putting it up to God to either rescue her or let it make her sick. And it is either causing her to miscarry, like a forced abortion, or it is making her infertile so she cannot have kids in the future. It's kind of the two ways that people tend to translate it and tend to look at it. This is a strange passage. This is one of those, so at Johnson University, we had a class and we were put in a group and we had to read this, and we had about 20 minutes to make a 5-minute presentation on what it meant and how to interpret this as Christians. And that was one of the most uncomfortable classes that I was ever in, especially as a guy, trying to talk about this with a group that's 50% women. And so this is a passage that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And sometimes this passage gets caught up in political conversations regarding abortion and pro-life matters and things like that. But generally people read about it with two conclusions. One, she is not pregnant yet, and this causes her to become infertile. And if she's guilty, she will remain infertile. If she is not, then she can go on to have kids, or it causes her to miscarry or something like that.
But it doesn't.
Alexander, this was interesting to me because it reminded me of the Salem witchcraft trials.
I thought the
yes.
same thing.
Exactly. And the other thing was when I was kind of trying to read some background on this, or some explanation, some of the sources that I read online talked about the husband's jealousy. And so obviously as a woman, I think the Bible was written by men. Men controlled society.
There is no companion passage where the man drinks it.
No,
Yeah.
no, exactly. So very discomforting.
Doesn't that, it's hard to believe that God would give this direction. It almost seems like witchcraft.
It does.
Men wrote the book.
And so we will say, so one part about this, so while the ritual of the bitter water appears almost superstitious to us, because it does, this is reflecting a time period when if a woman was accused by her husband, she would have no hope. And so there is a chance of saying this puts it in God's hands to make that final verdict. If we're trying to look at a hope or a positive part, that's what I would leave us with. But this is a very uncomfortable passage. It makes many people uncomfortable. And it's okay to sit in it and be like, Because that's how I feel reading it. I'm like, this is one of those passages some scholars think might have been an inherited ritual, particularly from Canaanite cultures. There are some other similar rituals. And so this section might be added, because it's even, some of the words used are different words, like it's using words for thigh instead of womb, when it's talking about a womb, and it seems really unclear. And so there might be, this is something inherited from Israel's kind of pre-Israelite history. sort of thing. Any other conversation around this?
Just one thing, your mention of women being unclean during their menstrual period. This reminds me a lot of some of the societies in Africa and other countries where women are separated, housed separately for the duration. And maybe it was God's plan that we should get that week of rest every month.
So I heard that sermon, I was like, I like that.
But that's part of the Jewish Orthodox culture even today.
Is to still have a break? It's something we could use, instead of charcoal. Well, yeah, okay. All right. Let's move on to chapter 6 and 7. I'm glad. That seemed like it went really smooth. So chapter 6 and 7, I really like chapter 6. Chapter 6 has to do with the Nazirite vow. This picture is for chapter 7. I couldn't find a good picture of a Nazirite. And so when you think of a Nazirite vow, think of John the Baptist. He was one that would not drink with Jesus and his disciples. He lived out in the desert, kind of separate. This is almost like a precursor to the Christian monastic traditions in many ways. And so for those that were not Levites and were not in professional religious service, they could take a vow, and I didn't know this, of a temporary time or for permanent to live in dedicated religious service. And there were 3 main vows that came with it. And so they were to not drink, they were to not cut their hair, and then they are to not touch the dead. Samson, the story of Samson is a good picture of this. So he was given to a Nazirite vow as a child, and his whole life, every step along the way for Samson, he does every single thing wrong. And so he lets Delilah cut his hair. His first thing, he gets drunk at a wedding with the Philistines. And his life was supposed to be to purify the land of the Philistines. But he goes to a wedding and gets drunk with them. Then they cut his hair, and then there's a scene where he finds a dead lion and scoops out honey from it. And so he breaks every aspect of the Nazirite vow. If they do break the vows in this passage, there's what do you do? So if you do touch a dead body, you can make sacrifices to kind of return to your vow. And then when you're ready to end that vow, there is a set of rituals and sacrifices that they do as well. This is in college, the way they told us to remember it: no dick, no body, no booze. And so that's the kind of summation of the Nazirite vow. To me, this is special because, there's a way for them to have offerings if they break the vow or if they're ready to be finished with it. To me, this is special because non-Levites can serve too. When I read these passages, for me, here in Numbers in particular, it's like this community of God is beginning to expand. And so at first, it's like God was looking for anyone in the world who would be this people that could remake the Garden of Eden and build a temple there where God can dwell. And no one was there. And so God picks Abraham and creates his own people to make this. And now that nation is there. But it's not like this nation is there to just be them. Anyone else is included. And so now it's not just the Levites that can live this life. Non-Levites can come too. And eventually we're going to see you don't even have to be an Israelite, and you can participate as well. These passages, they're really meaningful. And there's these hidden gems in there that when we look at, we go, wow, we are really beginning to see people grow to what God wants them to be. And I think that's really why I like Numbers.
So Alexander,
Yeah.
when you say a non-Levite, that would be
Any Jew.
anybody, any of the groups that normally would only be able to go to war.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
There's provisions for them to have a religious life, like a professional religious life. It kind of is like a precursor to monks. So it's like not everyone's a priest, and this is like what I think about it. They can be a monk. As we come to the end of chapter 6, so God instructs Moses to teach Aaron and his sons this very specific blessing over the Israelites. What's really cool about this blessing that you might recognize is God is the one doing the blessing. And so the priests are just declaring that God's already blessing the people, which is kind of cool. And so this is that blessing. Thus you shall bless the Israelites, you shall say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So they shall put my name on the Israelites, and I will bless them. This, I think I sent this one out in the email, right? Yeah, okay. So if you recognize this, you probably hear it in church a lot. And here it comes from here in Numbers chapter 6. And it's special for this. The blessing is coming from God. It's not coming from the priest. It's not coming from Aaron. It's coming from God, and they're just declaring it. And this blessing is God has claimed this people as God's own. And so it's almost like saying, you can't make the blessing go away. And so it's a special blessing.
Is this the only place where this blessing appears?
You guys ask really good questions.
I mean, it sounds so familiar. Is it in the New Testament at all?
You know, I saw Father Christopher walk by. We should ask him. My Bible right here does not have any other quotes or references to this. So maybe this is where it comes from. This does become a rather popular blessing, though, and used in a lot of liturgy even before Christian traditions. So it might be, but I would love if someone looked that up. The Aaronic blessing. Chapter 7 is where some of the things change. So it is essentially summarized in this picture. So here all of the tribes go every single day and make the same offering. And the chapter goes through and names what leader of which tribe and what they bring, which is all the same thing. But they end up with 12 silver dishes, 12 silver bowls, which is the equivalent of 2,400 shekels of silver. They're also bringing flour, they're bringing gold, they're bringing bulls and rams and lambs, they're bringing goats and all these other things as well. And so they're bringing a lot of offerings. And so kind of yet again, we're dedicating the temple. Oh, and they bring wagons and oxen to transport their offerings and sacrificial animals. Okay. Yeah, that kind of summarizes that chapter there with that picture. Any questions on that? This part's kind of repetitive. Okay. Chapter 8 is one that deals with the Levites. Yet again. And so what we're seeing happen in these chapters is a rededication of the tabernacle to kind of get it in full use now. Now that the camp is there and everything's laid out, we're seeing its third time getting started. And so yet again, the Levites are consecrated and they light those special lamps. Remember, those lamps are kind of representing God's presence and everything. And again, it talks about the service of the Levites. So they are to serve from ages 25 to 50. 50 is retirement. And there is a specification here. So these are the Levites that are not Aaron's sons. So Aaron's sons are serving at the altar and doing the sacrifice. The other Levites are serving Aaron's sons and doing the dirty work and everything else, and carrying everything and keeping it clean. That's chapter 8. Any questions on chapter 8? Okay. Chapter 9 is really cool. And so chapter 9 is the second Passover. It's really fascinating for me. I had looked up second Passover in reference to this. And I found out that that's a term many people will use, the second Passover, that there is the pinnacle Passover feast, and then for those that couldn't make it then, whether they were sick or they're not living in Israel or something, there is second Passover. And so it's a little bit later, and it's, oh, I missed Passover, and there's another offering for it. So a lot of Jews today will use second Passover in that phrase. And it comes here from this chapter, in chapter 9. And so this is about 1 year later, after the Exodus has taken place. Passover is on the 14th day in the first month. And so we are directly 1 year out. And there is instructions for how to have Passover for those that couldn't make it, for those that were unclean at that time, and for those who are non-Israelites or not Jews. And then there's also the second part of this chapter that deals with the cloud that's going to guide everyone. This part is really cool for me because when you become unclean, there is a timestamp for becoming clean again. And so if that crosses over with Passover, you've missed out on the main feast of the year. At this time, the Passover is like the pinnacle feast for the Israelites. And so there's provisions made for them. And then, again, that really special part for me, it's not just the circumcised, it's not just Israelites. So kind of at this time, it would seem like there were a lot of non-Israelites that had joined this group. We kind of talked about this when we did a special session on the 12 tribes of Israel, that some of those tribes seem to be made up of primarily Egyptians or primarily Canaanites or others. And so there's provision made for this. It's almost like a confederation of people is growing up around the worship of Yahweh. And so there's provisions made for those that are not true Israelites to come in and be a part of the people. Yes. And then there is the cloud of God's presence. And so this is that cloud that by day is a black cloud, and then at night is the pillar of fire. And this is the instruction kind of for when they move and when they go. And so it's almost comical. It's like if it's there for one day, they stay for a day. If it's there for a week, a month for a month. And so what we're getting is they're being guided by God. And so their full trust is in God and God's protection. And you can even think about this. If you're out in the wilderness, and out in the desert, where would you want to go with your camp?
If you're what?
If you're in your camp in the middle of the desert, where would you set up your camp? Or where would you go? I'd want to go near water, but I'd want to make sure that water is not near anyone else because I don't want to get in a fight. And so they're putting their complete trust in God. That's what this is symbolizing. Everything that they have is trusting God to guide them for when they stay and everything. So they're completely dependent on God. And that's going to help us think about when they begin to complain, they're rejecting God. So they're completely stuck on God and God guiding them. Any questions on that?
You refer to the second passage,
Yeah.
second Passover. Now we started at Genesis. Have we come to a first Passover?
We did in Exodus.
Oh, in Exodus.
So in Exodus, the first Passover is the guardian angel coming over and everything. And there's like 3 Passovers that happen there because it happens, the Passover happens. And then there is an explanation of, I want you to make a feast to remember this, and this is what you shall do. And then there is them doing it, and then there is later another reference back to it, and now it's happening for a second time. So it feels like we've had 5 or 6. But in the calendar, this is 1 year out from the Exodus.
I'm thinking backwards right now. Moses must have had sons. Would they not have been jealous of Aaron's sons?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So it's an interesting thing about that. One of the things that we see happening here, so Aaron, Miriam, and Moses, that are all brothers and sisters, are the religious leaders. But Moses also is ruling, not as a king, but he's king-like. He's the political power. And so political power for the Israelites was never supposed to be hereditary. And so Moses and his authority only is Moses, and it doesn't pass to any of his family. That's different to Aaron because Aaron's sons become hereditary with their spiritual power, if you will. And there's a few reasons for that. One is because they don't want that power concentrated. Also because these are written when the tribe of Judah is the political power. And so you don't want to write about the Levites having political power because it's differentiated. The religious power is with the Levites, the political power is with the Judites. But at this point, it's representing God as the king. And so there's no hereditary power. And the power structure after this happens with the judges. And so Joshua becomes the successor after Moses. And then we see kind of different judges when they get into the land that take over. But it's very purposely not concentrating the political power in a person, and it's not hereditary. And so, yeah. And they were never supposed to have the king. It was always supposed to be a loose confederation with God as the king. That's a great question. I want to check back in on our outline map here, because we are about to set out on travel. And so as we come into chapter 10, we are here at Mount Sinai, but at the end of 10, we begin the travel. And we're beginning to come to the wilderness of Paran. So this is where we'll start next time, but I want to make a point because we're about to move. We have been on Mount Sinai since the middle of Exodus. We have been there for a very, very long time, and we're getting ready to move. And so this chart, we used to check in here every single week while we were walking around, and we have not moved anywhere. So finally, one of our colors is about to change. So that next red star right here is about to turn gold. So it'll be gold when we come next week. So it'll be exciting. I'm happy for our chart to move. But that gets us here into chapter 10. Kind of the summation of this chapter is the departure of Sinai. The chapter opens with the making of 2 silver trumpets. And what's really interesting about the trumpets, so again, God is the one who tells us when to go and when to stay. And so, like it's not obvious enough that you see a cloud moving, they also make these 2 trumpets, and when it moves, they would blow the first trumpet, and the trumpet blows signal how they move. And so, there is a very detailed list and order for which groups begin to move out, for the tribes and then for the clans around the tabernacle, and how they're structured so that essentially half of the congregation is in the front and the tabernacle is in the middle when they carry out, and it's kind of surrounded so that they stay safe. What's interesting too about these trumpets is though it's not just for travel, it also dictates when they're about to go into battle. So if there's an enemy, they use these same trumpets with a different call. It also signals the beginning of the new month. So it is their calendar keeping track, and when they have religious festivals or are calling together, they would use these same trumpets. So I guess it's kind of like a town bell that would go off. And here in the middle of the chapter, we're going to see the journey begin. And then it's going to end with Moses in this plea to his brother-in-law. And we're going to get to that one in a second. But I want to look at this section of verses 13 through verses 28. I have it on the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm a little bit out of order. We are going to talk about the brother first. I'm sorry. I think my slides are out of order here. Okay, we're just going to look at what's next because I think I might be missing a slide. Well, let me wait. Okay, I'm missing a slide. Okay, so I'm sorry. My slides are out, and that always throws my brain off when that happens. So essentially, the chapter ends with Moses and his plea to his brother-in-law, Hobab. So if you remember Jethro or Ruel, so that is Moses' father-in-law to his first wife. And he is a Moabite. And Moses asks and pleads for his brother-in-law to come with him. It would seem like Jethro or Ruel has maybe died or something like that. And so now the brother-in-law is the leader of the Moabites. It's kind of what it looks like. And essentially Moses is asking that they would join their clans together and that they would come with them and that God's blessing would come over all of those who come with them. So yet again, we're seeing this expansion. It's not just Israelites, it's anyone who will follow God. And the brother-in-law says, no, I'm going back to my people. And Moses pleads with him. And that's kind of like if you're reading a chapter or a book, it's the end of this chapter of Moses with the Moabites. And so maybe his first wife is dead or something, but that chapter ends and they're done with the Moabites. The next time we see the Moabites, they're our enemy. And so this chapter is now gone. And yeah, that's kind of what happens there. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. We might have another slide pop up about that somewhere. And so I like the part that this says. So this is how chapter 10 ends. Whenever the ark sets out, Moses would say, "Arise, O Lord, let your enemies be scattered and your foes flee before you." And whenever it came to rest, he would say, "Return, O Lord, to the 10,000 thousands of Israel," or the large group of Israel. What's interesting about this is on either side of this passage, there's just the Hebrew word none. And the commentary I was reading said that it's almost like this is a parenthesis in Hebrew. And so this seems to be this section that kind of sets off this little blessing part. That was probably added by a redactor or an editor. But this begins what we call the murmurings, or the murmuring tradition. The next section of chapter is that rebellion is going to grow. And so people complain and complain and complain and complain. And the other part that I wanted to say about this, so in the scene about the departure, some of you might find this interesting. A lot of scholars will say there is this is coming from the two traditions. There is a version of it from the priestly account, and then there's a version of it from the non-priestly account. And they also take the murmuring tradition and they divide it up too. A lot of the scenes get duplicated, and so they think that there are two versions that they then kind of lay in like this, and they all have a different focal point. But for this part with the departure from Sinai, the priestly account describes the departure from the wilderness of Sinai, and that's the phrase it used, wilderness of Sinai. And here they're led by the cloud, and it's going to use a lot of the language, the characters, and the way that the tribes are organized from the first part of the book of Numbers. But a lot of scholars will say there's also a non-priestly version of this. And here it doesn't say Mount Sinai, it just says Mount of the Lord. And now they're not led by the cloud, they're led by the Ark of the Covenant. And so they kind of have different focal points. I seem to have lost a slide about Moab and the Moabites. Yeah, okay. That's all right. Did anyone have questions there about chapter 10? Okay. Cool. We are going to begin to look at the complaints. And so here in chapter 11, the Israelites are going to begin to complain about food and a lot of other misfortunes. This is one of those chapters I find a little bit strange. I'll just be honest. Because there's a lot of anger from God in this. And one thing I try to keep in mind when I am reading this is oftentimes for the Israelites and for all of us, the things that they're complaining about aren't the real complaint. And so this is a rejection of God and God's way of life, as it were. And so when we read this and God has the response that God does, I'm trying to keep that in mind, is that they are rejecting God. And they're saying we want to go back to Egypt. It's not because they had a good life in Egypt. It's because they want to go back to Egypt's gods and everything like that, in that way of life. When they're complaining, they say, "Oh, if we could just go back to Egypt." They didn't have any better of a life in Egypt. Their life is better now. They are craving the lifestyle and everything else that came with Egypt and Egypt's gods and everything. This starts off, and this one it's a little comical. They complain because they don't have any meat, and so and they're complaining about the manna that there is. And the response to this that we'll look at here in the slide, it's funny. Moses then is also feeling really burdened. If you remember when we were back in Exodus, and I had like a little comic strip, and it's Moses leading everyone almost like a car ride. And he's like, "We'll get there when we get there," and they're all complaining about everything. I feel like this here. It's like that road trip with the toddlers in the back, and they just want to get out of the car. It's kind of how Moses feels. What's special here is Moses comes to this point. my slides are different than when I went over them before. Moses comes to this moment of feeling overwhelmed, and it's almost like he can't take it. And so God directs Moses to appoint 70 elders to kind of help him in the care of all of the people, and to also act as intermediaries between God and all of the people. It's almost like it's getting too much for Moses. And so Moses appoints these 70 elders. They go before the tent of meeting, and God sends out God's own spirit onto everyone, including the 70 elders. And they, in the text, it says they begin to prophesy, which is to say they begin to speak for God as well. It's really cool is because here Moses has served as prophet, and now that prophetic role is growing to include other people as well. And then this chapter ends with God providing the quail. And this part I find really funny. So, and I put a quote of it for us to read. So this is what he says. And say to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow you shall eat meat. For you have wailed in the hearing of the Lord, saying, if only we had meat to eat. Surely it was better for us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall not only eat it 1 day, or 2 days, or 5 days, or 10 days, or 20 days, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you. Because you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and you have wailed before him, saying, why did we ever leave Egypt? There is a lot of humor that's going to happen in these chapters, and this is just the beginning of it. We'll see in the next chapter it's funnier. And so the summation of that is they have complained about not having meat, and so God gives them meat and meat and meat. And it even gives the measurements for how much meat, and it's like each Israelite is collecting hundreds of pounds of quail, which you can just imagine how stinky that would be. And so here's what I really like about this. God has a sense of humor, and we see that reflected here. Also, there are complaints. They're not just about food. Their complaints are at God. They're complaining about God. And that's why there's such a serious response to it. Here, God lets God's own spirit rest on all of these other elders. And this is signifying not only God's help for Moses, but God's grace in the expansion of this prophetic role. You really do see in these chapters, there's an expansion and an inclusion for all of this whole thing that God is doing here. What's really fascinating about this, and I don't remember this before, but so there's the 70 elders that come before the tent of meeting. And God's like, hey, bring these 70 and I'm going to put my spirit on them and they're going to prophesy and everything. And that happens. And then someone else comes running and it's like, Moses, there's these other 2 guys back in the camp and they're prophesying too. You need to shut them up. And Moses is saying, no, why would we stop this good thing God's doing? And so it's almost like God's spirit is so generous, you can't contain it. And it's contagious and it's spreading to others. I really do like that little story slipped in right there. And then this chapter ends in a weird way to me. And I find this part really strange, but it seems like out of nowhere, God just kind of runs out of patience. And there is a plague that just kills a bunch of people. And that's how the chapter ends. One thing that I think we kind of see here, it's almost like God's like, if you're just going to complain about meat, I'm going to give you so much meat you won't be able to contain it. And they don't repent. And so they get more meat and more meat and more meat, almost so much that that meat rots. And the thing that they asked for is the thing that makes them sick. And it's because they never repented. That's kind of the only conclusion I can draw from this. So I'm going to say that's what it means. But I don't know. Any questions on this part?
I've always thought what an irony the quail were.
Yeah.
Well, why not send deer or rabbit? What is symbolic about the quail?
I guess that's just what blows around in the desert or something. I don't know.
Didn't they want fish?
They did. Yeah, there's this funny part where, where is that here? It's where Moses, so he says,
chapter 4, or verse 4.
Is it verse 4? Well, then he's like, how are you supposed to feed all these people?
We remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt for nothing.
Yeah. And then Moses is like, I've got 600,000 people here. How do you expect me to gather all this food for them?
Sounds like the feeding of the 5,000.
In many ways, yeah. It is like, so in the feeding of the 5,000, which is like the 5,000 men, also their women and their children, and they have that small amount of fish and bread, and at the end they have 12 baskets overflowing with food, which is to say there is an excess, which is kind of what you see a lot here.
It says that we remember the fish we ate in Egypt.
Oh, here it's down at the bottom. But Moses said, the people I am with number 600,000 on foot, and you say, I will give them meat that they may eat for a whole month. Are there enough flocks and herds to slaughter for them? Are there enough fish in the sea to catch them? And God says to Moses, is the Lord's power limited? Like, would you question me that I can't feed you? You've seen what I did. Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not. So there's a lot of power play that's happening right here.
Where's that verse?
That's 22, or 20, starts in 21.
11.
Of chapter 11.
I was going to say about the quails too. I think it's interesting because yes, they could have had deer, but it didn't take a lot of work to feed a lot of people on deer. Quails
That's
are
true.
work.
That is true. That is, yeah.
You got to do a lot to them before you can eat one. It's not going to fill you up.
For a lot of birds like doves, you can just kind of pop out the breast meat, and that's about 80% of the meat, and you kind of toss everything else
Quails
away.
are smaller.
Are they?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's right.
They're very small.
Yeah, those are the little ones. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now I wonder if that has something to do with it too.
I don't know, because they take a lot of work. I mean, it's be one thing to slay something. and
There
feed
is a lot
people.
of power struggle and irony that happens here, so I wouldn't doubt that that's a little bit of it.
Working in their mealtime.
There's also this scene here in chapter 12 with just a lot of humor. And so here's this kind of famous picture of this scene. So you'll see Miriam. You can't even see her face. She's so disfigured there. That's intentional. So it's because of what happens here. And so here, Miriam and Aaron, again, these are the brother and the sister of Moses, come to complain. And so essentially, they're filled with quite a lot of jealousy, and they also have some criticism against him. What's really cool here is God comes to defend Moses, and on Moses' behalf. And then you see this punishment to Miriam, and then it ends with them interceding for Miriam and then waiting on her. And so
that's why you don't see her face, because of leprosy.
Oh, what is happening? Yeah, okay, so they speak out for her marrying a Cushite woman, and then after 7 days, they have to wait for her to be healed in the wilderness. And so they don't leave her there, they wait on her, but she has to go outside the camp. And it would seem like when she is struck with the leprosy, this is your life now. But Aaron and Moses plead on God's behalf, and they say, look, if there was some other kind of sickness and she was struck, it would be 1 week. Just give her 1 week. She'll learn her lesson, kind of idea. What I really, really like about this passage. So Moses has been married to Sephora, and she is the Midianite, so from Moab. Yeah. But now he's married to this Cushite woman. And so Cushites, they're from the south of Egypt in the northern Africa, and they have very, very, very dark black skin. It's kind of what this region is known for. What's funny, Miriam is struck white with leprosy. And so you'll see kind of in the icon where she looks kind of white as she is covered over. There is some irony happening here. And there is a lot of humor that comes in. I think I was a freshman in Bible college, and I had never heard this story before. And we had a professor talking about just why he loves the Old Testament so much. And this was the story he shared with us. And for me, it changed a lot of the way in which I read the Bible, which I look for the funny parts. Because I see them everywhere. But they're there. But what's really cool about here, as we're seeing this expansion of really what it means to be Israel, like to be Israel is to be the people that follow Yahweh. it doesn't mean to be the descendant of Abraham. And there's this expansion of those that are included. And so we see it with the Nazirite vow, that those who are in priestly service, you don't even have to be a priest. We see it there with who's the ones that can do Passover. Well, even the immigrant in the land can do Passover. And now it's almost like there's a little bit of pushback. Well, look at her skin. She's not one of our people. And God strikes her with it. And this is an important passage to read. This is also a passage that becomes quite popular for interracial marriage. And so this is one of the passages that's used for a lot of Christian arguments when it was rather controversial for some of the first interracial marriages to take place. They would point at this passage. And so this is a passage that kind of throughout pretty modern history became meaningful for a lot of people because of that. That's Numbers 12. This is just one of my favorite scenes. It's funny, but it's also serious when you look at it. And you begin to see kind of God's heart, which is both humorous but also serious in the things that matter. And God is serious about people being included and serious about worship. That is Numbers 4 through 12. It was a lot of material to cover, so I don't have a video today because I couldn't find one that I liked a lot. So,
do you find it interesting that Miriam was punished with leprosy, but we don't know what happened to Aaron?
Right.
You know, we were still working on the gender roles here, I guess. And they said, has the Lord spoken through Moses? Yeah, that's interesting.
It is.
You can Google.
Well, it's typical.
Patriarchal society.
Yes.
And it continues.
They don't care what you do.
Oh, yeah, they were both complaining, and it's just Miriam. So, you know, there's some parts that we're waiting for the New Testament, and that's why there's another half. Thanks for pointing that out.
About God showing his sense of humor.
Yeah.
I like that because that's the quail.
Yeah.
I've hunted quail. And there's about 2 ounces of meat on a quail.
Yeah, I like this thought of it taking a lot of work.
And they're hard to catch.
Uh-huh.
And so you have to have a big pile of quail to have a meal. For
Well, they
sure.
did have hundreds of pounds of them, so I guess that was a
So
number.
God could have sent, as I said, he could have sent rabbits or deer or anything. And he sent quail.
I used to eat quail every year for my birthday. This is just bringing back memories. That was always what I wanted, and I would eat like 5 quail.
Yeah, that's a lot.
This is bringing back memories for me. I was picturing a dove, which kind of has a good amount of meat there, but.
And maybe God was saying, yes, you can have this meat, but you're going to have to work for it.
You're gonna have to work for it, exactly.
The manna was easier.
It didn't come out their noses.
As we kind of continue, so just again as a reminder for our schedule, we're moving out of Sinai, so we're gone now. We're going into the wilderness of Paran, and so we're going to cover those next week. But next week we'll be looking at chapters 13 through 18. I am curious, though, if anyone has last questions or comments kind of on what we covered or revelations that you would want to share. Well, if not, say go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Well, I have a question. It has
Oh,
nothing to do with that. So we're ending on May the 9th, right? Is that the last one?
Supposedly.
Okay. And then we won't meet this summer, or we?
Yes, so, okay, I've got to look back at the church calendar. I was trying to find it today, and it's not updated in the public calendar. We will close in May, and I think it's the week before June is when we're going to stop. But I do want to still maybe do something about once a month. And so we won't start Deuteronomy but we can cover some other special topics, just so we're still kind of regularly together a little bit over the summer.
So maybe meet once in June and July and possibly August.
Yeah. I've got to, because when we did our calendar planning, it was all on the schedule, but it's not been updated in the other calendar. Yes.
I just want to make a plug for our lunch bunch next
Oh.
Tuesday. Christopher will be speaking. I can't tell you what the subject is, but I think it'd be good to support.
Should ask him about the quail. And who is in need of one of these charts? 1, 2, 3, oh my gosh, 4, 5. 5? Okay, all right. I will get some of those made. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know, it's so cute. You do a great job.
Yeah.